For nearly half a century, the residence of Rob Reiner and his wife Michelle stood as an unshakable monument to Hollywood stability, a rare beacon of warmth in an industry often defined by fleeting relationships and fractured homes. To the outside world, the Reiner household in Brentwood was the picture of an idyllic American dream, a sanctuary where 4 children grew up under the protective wing of a legendary director and a devoted mother surrounded by laughter that seemed destined to echo forever. But on the chilling evening of December 14th, 2025, that carefully cultivated illusion was shattered in a single violent heartbeat. The tragedy did not arrive with the slow, ominous creep of a storm, but struck with the sudden, brutal precision of an icy blade, severing the peace of a quiet winter night just days before Christmas. Inside the very walls that had once sheltered their happiest memories, a horrific sequence of events unfolded, claiming the lives of Rob and Michelle instantly and extinguishing 2 of the entertainment world's brightest lights. When the flashing red and blue lights of the Los Angeles Police Department pierced the darkness of the exclusive neighborhood, the initial waves of shock were quickly replaced by a far more devastating realization. As investigators taped off the scene and the first reports began to leak to a stunned public, the narrative took a turn that no one was prepared for. The suspect, led away in handcuffs, was not a stranger nor an intruder from the shadows, but Nick Reiner, the couple's own son. For a brief, suffocating moment, the world stood still, unable to reconcile the image of the beloved creator of heartfelt classics with the bloody reality of a double homicide committed by his own flesh and blood. Yet this arrest was merely the first tremor of an earthquake. While the police worked to piece together the mechanics of the crime, a heavy, oppressive silence fell over Brentwood, a silence that many hoped would allow the souls of the departed to find rest. But that quiet was destined to be short-lived, for the true story of what happened behind those closed doors was far more complex and far more heartbreaking than a simple headline could ever convey. Not long after the yellow crime scene tape was removed, the eerie calm that had settled over the tragedy was shattered once more. This time not by violence, but by a voice trembling with raw grief. Tracy Reiner, the daughter Rob had adopted and loved as fiercely as his own blood, stepped forward into the unforgiving glare of the public eye. Her revelations sending shockwaves through a community already in mourning. She spoke of an unfinished will of apologies that died in the throat, and of a profound silent pain that had festered behind the family's manicured exterior. If Dad had lived just one more day, she wept, her words hanging heavy in the air like a prophecy unfulfilled. Perhaps everything wouldn't have been pushed this far. But before the world could fully process her sorrow, Romy, the biological daughter, added another layer to the narrative, pouring oil onto the smoldering fires of suspicion. She suggested that the root of this nightmare lay in the unequal distribution of a father's love. Rob Reiner was indeed a man who placed family above the glittering allure of Hollywood, a father who viewed his children not as extensions of his ego, but as his entire world. With Tracy, Jake, and Romy, his love was a steady, nurturing current, effortless and warm. He was the father who sat with Tracy on quiet evenings, offering the kind of unconditional support that made the world feel safe. With Jake, he shared a spiritual bond, forged in the bleachers of major league stadiums, a love language of baseball passed down from grandfather Carl Reiner, where silence between innings spoke volumes of affection. And for Romy, the youngest, he was a sanctuary, a listener who absorbed her every worry and dream with tearful eyes, promising to be her anchor no matter where life took her. However, when it came to Nick, the melody of the household shifted into a discordant, jarring key. The relationship between Rob and his son was not built on the easy camaraderie he shared with the others, but was defined by a tension so thick it was almost palpable. Rob loved Nick, but it was a love defined by desperation, a father perpetually suspended between fragile hope and a constant gnawing fear. He watched Nick not with the pride of seeing a reflection of himself, but with the anxiety of watching a stranger slide down a path he could not follow. From childhood, a chasm existed between them, Rob anchored in structure and values, and Nick drifting toward rebellion and emotional instability. It was a disconnect that would soon spiral into a darkness neither of them could control. There were late nights in the sprawling Brentwood estate when the silence was not peaceful but deafening, filled only with the rhythmic ticking of a clock and the heavy breathing of a father waiting for a key to turn in the lock. While Rob Reiner was anchored in the familiar comfort of structure and values, Nick seemed to vibrate at a different frequency, one tuned to early rebellion and a profound emotional instability that no amount of parental success could soothe. By the time Nick turned 15, the shadows that had always lingered at the edges of his life began to consume him whole as drugs infiltrated his world with terrifying speed. It began with heroin and cocaine substances that quickly spiraled from experimentation into a severe, prolonged addiction that transformed the family home into a revolving door of crisis. Rob and Michelle were forced to become spectators to their own son's slow-motion destruction, watching helplessly as he cycled in and out of rehabilitation centers, more than a dozen times enduring periods where he vanished into homelessness, drifting across state lines like a ghost, while his parents lay awake, terrified that the next phone call would be the coroner. In a desperate bid to pull his son back from the abyss, Rob made a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his days. He chose the path of tough love. Heeding the stern advice of clinical professionals, he forced Nick into treatment against his will and severed his financial support, believing that hitting rock bottom was the only way to compel his son to face the consequences of his actions. It was a strategy born of love, but executed with a severity that felt like betrayal to a boy already drowning. Years later, with the clarity of hindsight, Rob would confess that this was the single greatest mistake of his life, a heartbreaking admission of parental failure. We trusted people with degrees hanging all over their walls, more than we were willing to truly listen to our own son, he lamented, realizing too late that they had believed the experts who labeled Nick manipulative, rather than hearing the cry for help hidden beneath the behavior. Embedded in that confession was the crushing remorse of a father who, in trying to save his child, had unknowingly pushed him further into the darkness. As a result, the chasm between them widened into a canyon of unshared pain and explosive arguments, where reconciliation felt less like a possibility and more like a fading dream, leaving Rob to wonder, in the quiet of his empty study, if he had lost his son long before the tragedy ever struck. There was a brief moment in time, years prior, when the release of the film Being Charlie appeared like a faint glimmer of light in the encroaching darkness, a fragile bridge built over troubled waters, where father and son tried to heal their fractured bond through the catharsis of art. But that bridge, constructed on the shaky foundations of semi-autobiographical pain, ultimately could not withstand the weight of reality. The tension that had simmered for decades finally boiled over on the evening of December 13th, 2025, just one day before the unimaginable would come to pass. The setting was Conan O'Brien's annual Christmas party, an event that should have been a sanctuary of warmth, sparkling lights, and festive cheer. Rob Reiner arrived with Nick, perhaps in a final weary attempt to maintain the facade of unity, but the air between them was thick with a toxicity that was nearly impossible to conceal. Amidst the clinking of glasses and the murmur of Hollywood's elite, the atmosphere suddenly cracked. In front of numerous guests, the veneer of the patient father finally slipped, and Rob raised his voice, scolding his son for behaviors he deemed unacceptable, his tone heavy with a mixture of exhaustion, anger, and profound disappointment. The room fell abruptly silent, the laughter dying in throats, as if everyone present sensed that something deeply unsettling, something far darker than a holiday spat, was taking place. Nick reacted fiercely, his eyes bloodshot and wild, his words fragmented, but carrying the weight of years of accumulated hurt and resentment. This was no longer an ordinary family argument. It was an eruption of long-suppressed anguish, the culmination of a father-son relationship perpetually wavering between love and pain. In that frozen moment, Rob uttered a single, weighty sentence that would echo like a final judgment. "I can't keep protecting you if you continue to live like this." With those words, he turned his back and walked away, leaving Nick standing frozen in the middle of the party, isolated in a crowd. Many later recalled that moment as a dark omen, the precise second when the final straw was laid and the last remaining hopes for reconciliation collapsed into dust. Christmas night was meant to be a time of togetherness, but for Rob and Nick, it ended in an oppressive silence and exchanged glances that no longer met, setting the stage for the tragedy that waited with the coming dawn. The dawn of December 14th, 2025, offered no warning of the darkness that was about to descend, but by mid-afternoon, the threads holding the Reiner family together had violently snapped. The tragedy unfolded with terrifying speed inside the Brentwood home, a place that had stood for decades as a sanctuary of art and love, now suddenly transformed into a horrific crime scene that would leave Hollywood reeling. According to the preliminary investigation, the catalyst was a catastrophic loss of control, a moment where Nick Reiner, driven by an unstable state of mind, fueled by addiction and long-suppressed rage, crossed a line from which there is no return. Police reports state that he rushed into the kitchen, his hands finding the handle of an ordinary household knife, the large blade Michelle had used countless times to prepare family meals, now repurposed as a weapon of unimaginable destruction. With that sharp blade, he attacked his mother, first inflicting severe injuries that caused Michelle to succumb rapidly to her wounds. Hearing the commotion from another room, Rob Reiner did exactly what he had done his entire life. He ran toward the danger to protect his family. But in the chaos and despair of that explosive moment, the father's intervention proved fatal. He too was attacked by his son, sustaining mortal wounds to the neck and chest. The violence was brief, chaotic, and final, leaving a silence in its wake that was heavier than death itself. It was around 3:30 p.m. when Romy Reiner, the youngest daughter, returned home expecting perhaps a quiet afternoon conversation with her parents. Instead, she opened the door to a living nightmare. She discovered their bodies lying motionless, a sight so shattering that it emptied her mind of everything but horror. Nick had already fled the scene, leaving his sister to face the carnage alone. Though his escape was short-lived, he was apprehended just hours later by the LAPD near the University of Southern California, held without bail on charges of double murder. As forensic sources later confirmed that the wounds were consistent with the recovered kitchen knife, the world shuddered at the realization that this was the most devastating ending imaginable. A father-son relationship, once nurtured by love and hope, now ended in blood. As the Christmas lights in the neighborhood began to twinkle on in the gathering dusk, all that remained inside the Reiner home was a shattered family and the echoing silence of a grief that would never find an answer. Yet, more painful than the headlines and the police tape was the moment when the silence was finally broken by the one person who had stood closest to the heart of the family. Amidst a Hollywood still engulfed in shock and mourning, Tracy Reiner, the daughter Rob had chosen to be his own, stepped forward to speak her voice, trembling as if every word tore away another fragment of her memory. She revealed that the pain had arrived too suddenly, too swiftly, leaving no time for goodbyes or preparation. "I had just seen my dad last week," she said through sobs, a sentence that made the truth feel more merciless than ever, highlighting the abruptness with which their world had ended. But it was what Tracy found in the days following the murders that would change the narrative forever. In a quiet evening, she entered Rob's private study alone, the room where he had crafted so many of his cinematic masterpieces. There on the old wooden desk, amidst unfinished scripts and pencils worn down by time, she discovered a brown notebook with no name on its cover. It had been sitting there for a long time, silent and unassuming, as if waiting for the right moment to be opened. Tracy hesitated, her heart pounding in the stillness before slowly turning the first page, instantly realizing that she had touched the deepest, most private part of her father's soul. The words inside were not production notes or movie ideas, but fragmented confessions filled with torment, written in handwriting more unsteady than she had ever seen. Rob wrote about Nick pouring out his regret for having stood too far away during the months of rehabilitation, realizing too late that the tough love he had been advised to give was perhaps the wrong medicine for a wounded soul. Perhaps I was wrong. He wrote the ink seemingly heavy with sorrow. Perhaps what he needed was not discipline, but someone sitting beside him, even if only in silence. Alongside these private confessions came the revelation of the parents' final will, a document that stunned those who expected a standard division. Rob and Michelle had left Nick a larger share of their assets than his siblings, not as a reward, but as a quiet form of compensation, a final message from the grave, acknowledging that he was the most vulnerable, the one who needed the most protection, the most patience, and the greatest compassion. They had loved him with a worry and anguish that consumed them, and in their final legal act, they tried to provide the safety net in death that they could not secure for him in life. As Tracy turned the fragile pages, reading lines blurred by the stains of old tears, she arrived at a passage that forced her to pause, her own breath catching in her throat. In these final entries, Rob confessed to a paralyzing fear that had haunted him for years, the fear that Nick might truly believe he had been abandoned by the man who raised him. If you think your father doesn't love you, then that is my fault. He wrote, the ink pressed hard into the paper as if trying to carve the truth into existence. I love you so much that I don't even know how to love you the right way. Tracy collapsed into the chair, clutching the notebook tightly to her chest, finally understanding that her father's stoic silence during those turbulent years had never been coldness, but a terror buried so deep within his heart that it rendered him mute. Amidst all those pages, drenched in regret, however, a fragile glimmer of hope still remained. Rob wrote that he did not dream of Oscars or accolades for his son, but simply of a day when Nick could live a life calm enough to breathe in peace. If you can wake up each morning without hating yourself, he wrote, that alone would be enough for me. Reading those lines, the tragedy crystallized into its most heartbreaking form. 2 generations who loved each other with everything they had yet possessed, no shared language to bridge the abyss between them. I'm sorry I wasn't there when you needed me. Rob wrote on the final pages a belated confession, that would never reach the ears of the son who sat in a jail cell just miles away. Tracy closed the notebook very slowly, as if afraid that even the slightest movement might disturb the ghosts of the words inside. In the empty room, she whispered softly into the void, "Dad loved Nick so much. They just didn't know how to say it to each other." The sentence dissolved into the silence, unanswered, yet it felt as though the old wooden walls themselves were quietly listening. In the end, the story of the Reiner family is not merely a tale of crime and punishment, but a profound cautionary tale about the fragility of connection. It serves as a devastating reminder that love, no matter how vast, can sometimes get lost in translation, and that the greatest tragedy of all is not death, but the words that are left unspoken until it is too late. As the world moves on, the Reiner home remains a silent monument to a father who tried a son who was lost, and the heartbreaking distance that lay between them.